Hello guys, and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program YouTube video. Today we're continuing our journey to interstellar travel by landing on Duna and Ike with one rocket. This is KSP Galactic Quest. This is a very powerful rocket, though the first stage actually doesn't have a great TWR, so I had to pitch up in order to continue my intended trajectory. If you want to recreate this rocket, you should probably use a first stage engine with slightly higher TWR. This Hydrolox rocket from Cryo Engines Extensions does have pretty great thrust, but it's pushing a rather large rocket, so it's not exactly the best for the job. If I recall correctly, this entire rocket had around 7,000 meters per second of delta V. If not a little more, the lander itself has around 3,500 meters per second delta V. If you want to recreate this mission properly, I suggest you add a bit more just to make sure you have plenty of leeway, because I could be wrong about how much delta V this rocket actually had. The best thing about this mission is that you don't actually need the interplanetary propulsion stage for a whole lot of stuff. All you need to do is just to get to Duna and return back to Kerbin. Because when you arrive at Duna, all of the work is being done by the lander, so you just land on Duna using parachutes, return to orbit, and then use the leftover fuel to go to Ike. And then you can just return to the cryogenic interplanetary propulsion stage and just return home. If you really need help, you can just use Duna's atmosphere, because I'm not going to use the interplanetary stage to capture around Duna. Instead, I'm actually going to aerobrake. Despite people constantly saying that aerobraking's for noobs, it really isn't. It actually allows you to save a whole lot of fuel and perform some rather odd maneuvers that save a whole lot of fuel. This mission is mostly modded, a whole lot of it, because the engines are all modded. They all use cryogenic propellants, while in stock Kerbal Space Program you just have plain old liquid fuel and oxidizer. To be honest, these engines actually aren't too overpowered. They only give you a slight buff when compared to stock Kerbal Space Program engines, because normal liquid fuel and oxidizer is still, in this save, one of the most dense rocket fuels you can use, so I don't need too many fuel tanks to get a similar amount of delta V. Though cryogenic engines do have a lot more ISP, so you could get more delta V, especially from the hydrogen engines. Now, instead of actually using a propulsion to capture around Duna, like I previously said, I will be aerobraking, because aerobraking saves a whole lot of fuel. I'm going to be using the trajectories mod to help me out here, because with trajectories installed, it can actually tell you what orbit you're going to end up in after you aerobrake, or where you're going to land if you're like doing a spaceplane return trajectory or something. So if you're flying spaceplanes or need to do really targeted landings in an atmosphere, I highly suggest getting the trajectories mod. Another thing that's important for performing interplanetary travel is to always collect science from around Kerbal, the sun, because you can actually get a whole lot of science just by being in interplanetary space. Another thing I've noticed about the entire rocket and mission is with reforged materials installed, it basically allows you to make all your parts shiny using a variety of shaders. Even the IVAs of the rocket parts become shiny. To be honest, I feel like parks have kind of been a neglected thing in terms of making KSP look like KSP2. Don't get me wrong, a whole lot of the modded parks, especially Restock, look amazing, but they always just still use the stock shader, which is why mods like Reforged Materials and Magpie mods do great, because they give all your parts in your install a fresh coat of paint. Instead of just being the boring stock shader, it's actually shiny and reflective. I mean, other mods kind of do this, especially Texturesunlimited Recolor Depot, where as well as making certain parts that are configured recolorable, I think it also makes certain areas like the windows shiny. It also allows you to change the shininess and specular qualities of parts. That's a great thing that part enhancement mods have done for Kerbal Space Program. Now, I'm fine-tuning my interplanetary approach to Duna because I want to make sure I end up in a stable orbit around it and not actually be incinerated in the atmosphere or get flung out again. If you're aerobraking at Duna like I am right now, I suggest a periapsis of around 25,000 meters or 30,000. 25,000 is around the trajectory I did, which got me a rather low orbit, for free by the way. But every encounter is different, so you might actually have to tinker with your encounter just to make sure you come in on a nice trajectory and don't get flung off into orbit or incinerated. That's why the trajectories mod is such a great thing to have. It just tells you where you're actually going to end up. Sometimes it's not very accurate, especially if you have some weird setup with heat shields and air brakes. Because if you deploy them, it actually changes the calculations, so sometimes what you are actually seeing right now may not be accurate in the end. But most of the time it's pretty accurate, so it's still a great mod to have around. Aerobraking at Duna is also pretty safe. You don't need a heat shield or anything, because Duna's atmosphere is actually rather tame. You can just stick the engine forward, and you should have nothing to worry about. Please excuse the spatial anomaly, I'll get rid of that very soon. Another great thing about Duna, especially with fireflies, that the entry effects are really beautiful, especially since Duna's atmosphere is different than Kerbin's. The colors are pretty different. I'm going to do another aerobrake pass, because the orbit I got wasn't actually the low orbit I was expecting. The good thing about aerobraking is that if you are too high of an orbit, as long as you're actually captured into an orbit, you can just keep aerobraking over and over again until you get the desired orbit, using little bits of propellant to minorly adjust your attitude if you really want to. If you want to stop aerobraking or go slightly deeper to aerobrake quicker, you can just use a little bit of fuel. It's easy because you don't actually need a lot of fuel to lower your periapsis on such an eccentric orbit that is often produced when you airbrake. I did something really clever here. Instead of returning to orbit and then dropping the lander and then using the lander's engine to go back down to Duna, I just transferred the Kerbals over and just let the lander continue on its way down all the way to Duna. Because I'm already on a suborbital trajectory as it is, I don't even need to use the engines to land. I just let the lander go and land on its own. But of course I still need the stage to remain in orbit, so I do use a little bit of propellant to get me back into a stable orbit that doesn't send me plummeting down to the surface. Duna itself is very easy to land on because you can just use parachutes to slow you down most of the way, and whatever velocity you have left you can just use with the engine you have on the lander. And in the end it's usually not that much, so you don't actually end up spending too much delta V to land. Ascent is also pretty easy, you don't need too much fuel to return to orbit. This lander as a Duna lander is severely overbuilt, but as a compound Duna and Ike lander, it actually just has enough. I'm not going to tell you how tight the fuel margins were, you'll just have to see for yourself at the end of this mission. It's a slightly minor inconvenience that we landed here, because we actually do end up landing on a hill. The other thing about this lander is that there are no laggers. Thankfully the EVA jetpacks are just powerful enough to get the Kerbals in and out of the lander. One thing that really bugs me about Kerbal Space Program landing legs is that they just have no friction. Are these landing legs made of ice? Because I just feel like I'm always ice skating when I land on a hill. Please, if someone could make a mod that buffs the grip and friction on these landing legs, it'd just make such a difference to everybody who plays Kerbal Space Program, because we've all dealt with this issue. Of course I have to collect all the science. This is a science save. And how else are we going to go interstellar eventually if we don't collect all the science in the world? I actually don't need to collect too much science because we do have wormholes in the save. I really want to speedrun interstellar travel because I just don't want to keep exploring the stock system. Everyone's already seen the stock system. I want to do something new. There are only 2 Kerbals on this lander. The third one is still in orbit, so I guess Bill Kerman is going to have a little bit of time to himself in Duna orbit. Now, if this were just a plain old Duna mission, I would have done it pretty well. Besides, this lander is pretty overbuilt, so it wouldn't have been that interesting. But we're not just landing on Duna today, we're landing on Ike too, which just so happens to be Duna's rather chunky moon. Well, it's not too big. Relative to Duna, it's actually pretty large. But it's pretty much the Mun, but with rigged spikes jutting out if you have Parallax 2 installed. So it's very similar to the Mun. In fact, I heard that the Delta V requirements actually aren't that different. You just need a little bit more fuel to actually get to Duna and back. And returning to Kerbin actually doesn't take that much fuel, because as long as you get an encounter with Kerbin and get it close enough to Kerbin's surface, you can just aero brake with a heat shield and you'll be fine. The Duna landing was actually pretty cheap. It only used around half of our fuel. And half of our fuel doesn't actually equal half of our Delta V, because fuel actually weighs a whole lot of stuff, and the more fuel you burn, the more efficient your engine becomes, because it doesn't have to push as much weight. It's kind of a problem that the engineers at NASA have to deal with, propelling actually weighing something. Getting to Ike is really easy. In fact, a whole lot of people actually keep getting encounter accidentally with Ike, because if you have a Duna orbit that's high enough, your spacecraft is going to get kidnapped and flung into interplanetary space by Ike. It's just the most annoying thing. It's kind of a recurring problem with two similarly sized bodies that are kind of in a binary, but not big enough to be considered a binary pair. You'll always end up being kidnapped by the moon. It's just the most annoying thing. We've already collected all of our orbital signs, so now it's just time to land and collect all the signs that lies down the surface. Parallax Continued adds a lot of personality to Ike, because instead of just being a Mun clone, it has a bunch of weird red spikes jutting out of the surface, which makes it a lot more unique and interesting to visit. I do have collisions enabled, mostly because I forgot to disable them for parallax scatters, so you actually can walk on them and jump on them and crash into them. I wonder what they're made of. Maybe some iron-based material, because iron tends to be pretty red, but I'm not actually sure because iron's usually not that red. Maybe some weird crystal instead. Who knows, maybe we could take a sample of them and bring them back home. Maybe they can be used for some exotic propulsion methods. We are starting to run pretty low on fuel, so it's time to rendezvous with an interplanetary transfer stage and get these Kerbals home. I actually was very worried about the state of this mission and it being a failure because I ran out of fuel, but everything turns out to work in the end. I can actually perform the rest of the mission using propellant, but to save on fuel that I might need later, I'm just gonna aero brake at Duna again. This is why Duna is the easiest interplanetary destination, because it has an atmosphere that is significant enough to be used for aero braking, but not too thick that it actually makes it harder to land on. When taking off from Duna, you almost get no atmospheric drag, because the atmosphere is so thin, but it's significant enough when you're descending that you can use parachutes. So Duna is very easy to land on. On the way back to Duna, we actually get caught in a solar eclipse thanks to Ike. Solar eclipses in Kerbal Space Program are a much more common occurrence than in real life, because the moon actually is on an inclined orbit, whereas the Mun and Ike are on equatorial orbits, so they often cause solar eclipses a lot more. We also passed by our old landing site, which is that little blue marker over there. Now, rendezvous in Kerbal Space Program are actually pretty easy. All you have to do is make sure your ascending node or descending node is as close to 0 degrees as possible. This means your inclination relative to your target is 0. After that, you just make a maneuver node to get the intersects as close to each other as possible. Once you arrive at your target, you can click the little thing above the nav ball that says surface or orbit, and click until it says target. Once it says target, you point retrograde. If you burn retrograde relative to your target, this basically cancels out all the relative velocity. Once it's 0 meters per second, you're basically in a complete standstill relative to your target. Then after that, you can just do the Matt Long lazy docking method and point both vessels toward each other, and then you can just dock effortlessly. And there we have it, a very successful Duna and Ike mission. To be honest, I can't actually say that yet until we return home safely, so that's what we're going to do next. Of course, I have to transfer all the scientific data from the lander into the command pod. This lander is just going to remain in Duna orbit. If you have enough fuel, you can probably just deorbit it and then return to orbit and return to Kerbin. But I'm not going to bother. This lander is just going to stay in orbit around Duna for the foreseeable future. Probably for the rest of eternity until Kerbal becomes a red giant or something. For now, I guess the lander will just stop thinking, just stay there and do nothing. Usually, I don't bother with transfer windows. I just go interplanetary and plot out maneuver until I get an encounter. It works out pretty well, but I end up wasting a whole lot of time in interplanetary space. The best part about returning from an interplanetary voyage is that all you gotta do to return safely is to dip your periapsis into Kerbin's atmosphere. And as long as you have a heat shield, you'll probably survive, because heat shields in the stock game are extremely overpowered. You could probably be coming all the way from Elu and have no problem decelerating. Sure, a couple of your Kerbals may black out from the G-forces, but they'll survive. I'm also going to add MechJeb to this playthrough because the smart ASS option it has is much better stability assist than the stock. One thing that really bugs me about stock Kerbal Space Program stability assist is that you always end up oscillating. It's like the most annoying thing. That's why I like MechJeb's smart stability assist. It's a lot more stable. It also has a bunch of other options that allow you to fly a lot safer. Especially the surface options, allowing you to adjust the pitch and a bunch of other variables in flight by the degree. It's very accurate and very convenient. Eventually we enter Kerbin's sphere of influence, but it turns out this trajectory also got me a Hmong encounter. Thankfully the flyby didn't actually affect my trajectory in a negative way. In fact, I might have actually fine-tuned it a little bit more. When returning from an interplanetary destination, I suggest going around to 30, 40 kilometers periapsis around Kerbin, because those usually offer the best results and almost always allow you to descend directly into Kerbin's surface. If you have a heat shield, you never have to worry about exploding. You come down on the grasslands. It's gonna be a little uncomfortable landing because it's not ocean. Doesn't really matter though, this is Kerbal Space Program, you can get away with these things. And there we go, safe and sound. Now that Duna Ike mission gave us over 6,000 science, so we're gonna spend that all on a bunch of tech nodes, unlocking larger rocket parts, nuclear propulsion, and a bunch of other things. Get some more tech nodes, especially some solar technology and some nuclear power as well. I don't want to go too deep into nuclear propulsion because I still want to use chemical propulsion for the foreseeable future. Though nuclear propulsion does give us a whole lot of perks, including some I'm not really supposed to have access to, because KSS2 adds a bunch of far future parts that you unlock super early for some reason. Don't worry, I won't be using those. They're not really balanced for the mods I'm using anyway. Now, to be honest, I didn't really spend all the science in the best way possible for my next mission, so I do need a little bit more to unlock a couple more technologies that are essential for future missions. So this is Aquarius I. It's going to land on the Mun on some biomes I skipped over last time I landed there. My first Mun landing only covered one biome, that being the Midlands. So this lander is going to land on a lot more, so I can collect a bit more science to unlock some more tech nodes to explore the solar system a bit more. I'm not going to spoil which planet I'm going to next, so I'll leave that up to interpretation until the next episode comes out. Like always, getting an encounter with a Hmong is very easy. You just gotta make a pro-grade maneuver and just move around until you get the proper encounter. Even if it's a bad encounter, you can always do a mid-course correction to fine-tune it later. The other thing about the Reforged Materials mod is that it doesn't really seem to affect fairing, which is pretty minor inconvenience. It probably look amazing with fairing. I should probably also mention that I forgot to put solar panels on this, so I gotta be really careful when it comes to running out of electric charge. These Hydrolox engines do have alternators, but the Methalox landing engines do not. So as soon as I decouple the stage, I will not be able to recharge my batteries at all. So it's going to be pretty risky. I also forgot to apply the brushed metal material to all the science experiments, but thankfully Reforged Materials allows you to change the shininess and shaders in flight. So I can just apply the brushed metal material to all the parts while I'm landing on the Mun. Is it realistic? Nah, but it's convenient and I just don't care, to be honest. I'm not gonna bother planting any flags. I already have a flag on the Mun. I'm just here for the science. This is gonna be a rather quick mission. These Methalox landing engines are from the mod Cryogenic Engines Extensions. It's a great mod if you like cryogenic engines, the original one by Nertea. Cryo Engines Extensions adds a few different types of engines that aren't filled by the original Cryogenic Engines mod, such as Methalox, Sustainers, Hydrolox launch engines. It also adds a new class of engine, that being the Orbital one, which fills a similar niche to the Terrier and Poodle engines. In fact, I'm actually using some of the Orbital Methalox engines. There's only two of them, those being the Shikra, which I'm using right now, and the Owl, which I believe is just a cluster of Shikra Methalox engines. Biome hopping is a really broken strategy to collect a lot of science, especially on low-gravity bodies like Migmus. Especially broken with Migmus because you can easily get there. In fact, it might actually be easier to land on than the Mun, because you don't need too much more Delta V to get out there, and the gravity is a lot lower, so making a lander is a lot easier. And you can do a whole lot of biome hops on Migmus thanks to the low gravity, and Migmus does have a lot of biomes, so that's how I got so much science so quickly. I just went on Migmus and went biome hopping. At this point, I felt like I've landed on enough biomes, so now it's time to return home. The fuel tanks are starting to get a little empty also, and with a Mun, biome hops are a lot more expensive than it is on Migmus. And sometimes it's a little deceiving because you feel like, oh yeah, I definitely have enough Delta V to do a biome hop, but then you just can't even return to orbit. So in doing biome hops to the Mun, you gotta be a little bit more cautious. Sometimes the Delta V readout doesn't actually tell you how far you can go because gravity losses are a thing. At this point, I also was pretty low on electric charge, but thankfully at this point, it doesn't really matter. Because when you enter Kerbin's atmosphere, usually the atmosphere kind of puts your craft in the proper position for you. In fact, I don't even have SAS on, and it's still pointing retrograde. If you're wondering what pod I'm using, it's the Pandora from Near Future Spacecraft, except I added a procedural part to make it a little bit wider. Because usually the shape of the capsule leaves it exposed to atmospheric heating even with a 2.5 meter heat shield, so I added a procedural part to make the overall diameter wider, and then I just tweak scaled the heat shield to make it all fit. And that little bit of science gave us enough science for a heavy landing and a bunch of other tech nodes. Now unfortunately, all of our future interplanetary and interstellar travels will have to wait until future episodes. Hope you guys enjoyed watching this one. I've been Nebula, and I'll see you all later.